In this episode, we revisit the question of whether Russia's goals in dividing and undermining America have been largely achieved in light of what seems to be an increasing one way love affair with Russia coming out of our political right. And in part two, we'll consider whether our society tends to overemphasize messages of victimhood to Black Americans in a way that is actually detrimental for Black Americans. Hello, welcome to the Call It Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and riding shotgun with me is a man whose takes sometimes may be too mature for a juvenile. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, you ready to turn this up to 400 degrees?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask that you please hit subscribe. On YouTube or on your podcast app. Give us a like. This really helps us as far as getting the show out there to more people. Now, recording this on February 19th, 2024. And Tunde, the idea that Russia's objectives in the U.S. From an influence standpoint, then that those objectives have already been achieved, was actually floated in the Washington Post a couple of years ago, 2020. And in the past few weeks, though, we've seen, members of Congress actively spreading Russian propaganda about how their Russia's victory in Ukraine is inevitable. We've seen, coming out of, media puff pieces coming out of the American media for mainstream, well, not necessarily mainstream, but what would present itself as mainstream media, puff pieces for the dictator in Russia, Putin, coming out of the American media. And so, essentially, we look back in 2020, they had seen nothing yet. So, to get us started, I want you to tell me, what do you make, at this current time in 2024 of the idea that Russia's influence objectives in America, which we'll touch on what those objectives were, but that they've been largely accomplished.
Yeah, I think I think no matter how someone feels about the way you ask that question, I think we can all acknowledge that our internal discourse and the way we deal with each other as Americans has definitely shifted over the last, let's say, 15, 16 years.
In a way that would presumably be beneficial to adversaries, correct, or people who see themselves as adversaries. And just to call out a couple of things, Russia was, or it's been said, according to our intelligence assessment back in 2017, that Russia's goal was to undermine the U.S.-led liberal democratic order. Another objective, which was that has been stated, this is from the Mueller report, was that Russia wanted to provoke and amplify political and social discord in the United States. So looking at those is like concrete from research back coming out of the U.S., either our intelligence community or investigative people. That's what Russia's been trying to do here, as far as influence in this country.
Yeah. And so I think, one of the things we can get into is why would they be motivated to do that? And also not just Russia, right? Why would other countries be motivated to sow discord in the United States? Number one, to potentially keep our eye off of them, right? If we're distracted, we're not looking around the world as much. Number two, to influence, I would say, the third and second world nations out there that are dependent on the first world nations, and competing for, their resources and their alliances. And so if you can show, other countries in the world that the United States is not as big and bad as everybody thinks, that our style of democracy and our soft power shouldn't be respected and appreciated around the world. We're not good allies, that when they, somebody gets invaded or is threatened of invasion, that we're going to back them up with our military. Those are all things that someone who doesn't have our interest at heart would want. So, it's understandable that Russia, along with other countries, I know our conversation today is on Russia, and its influence in our domestic politics, but any adversary of ours would have an interest in fomenting discord here, just like we do to other countries that we consider adversaries. I mean, this is part of nation states using proxy tools like espionage, intelligence, psychological operations, all that, instead of doing hot wars with each other. So this is
well, and then
not
there's other
abnormal.
tools as well. Like it could be, also trade is used as to try to influence someone's relative position in the world. I mean, and Russia considers themselves as a quote unquote peer of the America, and so in their mind, you can understand how if you decrease the relative influence of the United States, they can then increase their relative influence in the world, and so that's understandable. And as you pointed out, I mean, countries do this all the time, for different varying objectives. Right now, what's interesting about this, I think, is that we're able to see the Russia influence campaign as it's been talked about maybe in the 2016 election or even before that. Before they invaded Ukraine, it still could be discussed in a more abstract way. But right now, what we're seeing is that there are very specific and concrete ways that the Russian influence campaign is intended to be and is in fact being leveraged to help Russia attain goals that it specifically has that are beyond the United States. And so specifically right now, what we see in this, and we didn't have the benefit of this necessarily in 2020, even though, the war was starting then, but 2022, when this article in the Washington Post came out, which we'll have in the show notes, but by sowing discord in the United States right now, Russia is able to try to improve its chances in prevailing in Ukraine. Because what we do know is that Russia sees that while it wasn't able to run through Ukraine the way it thought it was going to be able to do, it sees that if it can get the United States to waver on the commitment to Ukraine or stop providing aid to Ukraine, that will be a significant domino in its ability to win that conflict. So there's an actual concrete way now that this type of influence can influence significant world events. If they can convince enough Americans that, oh no, you shouldn't be trying to help Ukraine, you shouldn't be trying to help this democracy, like you should let a dictator take over. It's all good. That's either in your benefit, or you shouldn't care, or you shouldn't want to spend the money. Then they can actually advance an interest they have, specifically, military objective, by through this influence campaign in the United States.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I want to continue on that vein, but real quick, I'll mention just this morning and just thinking about today's show, I decided to go back to one of my favorite reading things, which is George Washington's farewell address. And because I was reminding myself that didn't George Washington allude to some of this type of risk? And he actually did. So I'm not going to quote and get into it so people can go read his farewell address. But it's a good reminder that this is nothing new. Back then, in the formation of our country in the late 1700s, it was Spain and France that were trying to influence the young American government. Remember, they were adversaries of England. France had helped us in the Revolution, and I'm sure they were trying to call in a few favors. And so George Washington was warning the American people as he left office from being influenced, both negatively influenced, let's put it that way, against our own interests, both internally and externally.
I think the key piece on that, remember, though, was that the use of partisan divides, because it's one thing to have common goals and to be, quote unquote, influenced by somebody pointing out, hey, both of our interests are served if XYZ happens. But it's a whole other thing. What I think Washington really pointed out, and what we can see now, is that a lot of times if partisanship is the basis for so much that happens, if you have this high partisan divide, and Washington railed against partisanship, is that you can be influenced not necessarily for strategic reasons from a geopolitical standpoint, but just because it serves your partisan interests. And so therefore there's this risk when partisan interests become so high that you then put your partisan interests over your national security interests or things like that. And so that, I think, is the concern Washington expressed at that time is, are you going to undermine America because this other nation is giving you or trying to help you get a leg up from a partisan standpoint, but that's not necessarily helping you from a nation standpoint. And then that presently right now, is Russia able to use partisan carrots, so to speak, to or present things in a partisan way that helps Americans advance their interests versus something that the Americans put in, quote unquote, America first. But I do want us to keep moving. So the thought of just, and I want to nail you down on this a little bit, and I'm going to say, you're getting my piece first, but just the idea that it's been successful. If you lay out the two objectives that, based on, the U.S. government, that things that Russia has been trying to do, I think you would say that it's successful. But the interesting thing to me is that I don't think Russia's been successful specifically because they've created this tide of, hey, let's get Americans to, let's get Americans to be more divided, so to speak. It seems like Russia saw a wave that was rising, which was partisan divide in America, and saw it was an opportunity for them to try to push it along. But it seems like this boulder was rolling down a hill already, at least to our knowledge, before they were really involved in this. If they were really getting involved in 2012, 2013, like in that rate, when they were really amping it up, this boulder was already rolling down a hill at that point already. So to me, it seems like Russia has jumped into the fray and is adding more fuel to the fire that was already burning. But it does actually seem like the partisan divide, which inherently would undermine the kind of U.S. liberal democracy order, inherently, if there's a divide brewing in America that prevents America from being able to actually function in a way that countries would look at like, okay, that's a legitimate, the way that country operates is something I can kind of rely on and so forth. That seems to have happened. And then Russia may be accelerating and stuff like that and participating in it, or more particularly throwing their hat in the ring so they can more specifically benefit from the division. Like if let's create divisions that we can benefit from, as opposed to just divisions that generally bring America standing down. That to me, I think is notable here, is just that they didn't take the boulder up to the top of the hill. They didn't start it rolling, but as it started rolling, they seemed to said, okay, let's roll, let's try to direct this a little bit or nudge it a little bit this way in ways that'll benefit us.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, that's understandable. I mean, that's what nation states do to each other. I would say this: I'm totally, understanding of the idea that we were doing that in Ukraine, right? Like Ukraine was at the edge of being in between, kind of going back into the Soviet satellite style of operating with, crony oligarchs running it and stealing from the state treasury and all that, just like the Russian oligarchs and Putin himself. Or it had another faction that was very strong that wanted democracy and wanted to be closer to Western Europe, wanted to join the EU, wanted to be part of the way that we see the world, right? Democracies that are allies, that have treaties, that have free trade with each other, so on and so forth. And so we tried to subtly support the side of the Ukrainian system that was looking like it wanted to be allied with the West. And Russia didn't like that. So in retaliation,
that kind of thing goes back, like that's Cold War.
That's what I'm saying. That's like the normal stuff between us. Yeah. I mean, what do you think the Vietnam War was? Right? We didn't like that Russia was influencing China under Mao and spreading communism in Asia, and we wanted to stop it before it went what we felt was too far, and we had a war.
Well, but that's the end point that, as you point out, that you most of the time doesn't get there. Usually, these influence campaigns are in place of that, and it's
correct. That's when there's no more influence, no more politics. You're right, James. And another example would be, so that was an example of how, let's say, the Russians backed a group that we were fighting. Then you could say in the 80s, 20 years later, was the Mujahideen that we're backing. And it was like Vietnam in reverse for the Russians in Afghanistan. And so this is not new, right? And this is where I think it's interesting now, where this is why I think, going back to the initial start of the conversation, the Russian influence has been successful on this one because, and you're absolutely right, that's why I want to judge James. The truth to me is always somewhere in the middle. I'm not saying that Russia caused us to be divided. I think it's well said the way you put it, that we were already going this direction because of many things. I think the post 9/11 environment, the nativism, the fear that was already there, coupled with the economic crash of '08, coupled with the demographic shifts. And I hate to say this, but I do think that the presence of a black president did disturb enough people that once Russia comes in and really starts aggressively attacking us through the new medium, as you point out, the internet, like 2012, 2013. Remember, the iPad just came out in 2010, the iPhone in '08, Facebook and all that. I think it's 20 years old this year, but let's say by the time it got going, it was probably '06, '07. So my point is that all these technologies were very new, and the Russians did a good job of exploiting it. And I think part of it is I think they got lucky too. Like I don't think that they were. Yeah, I think they were surprised with the level of success that it had.
Yeah, so. And I think whether you can judge it on whether it's been successful, and I like the context you've given it because, like you said, people are always trying to do this, And again, some of it's underhanded necessarily. Some of it may not even be underhanded. It's just like Voice of America conceivably is a quote unquote influence campaign where you're trying to show people, tell people, hey, here's what's going on. You don't have to necessarily believe what your government says, yada, yada, yada. But I think the proof will be in the pudding, honestly, in terms of if, again, Russia tried to enhance the divisions that we're already building in the United States, and then also tried to kind of nudge them in those divisions in directions that Russia could directly benefit from. So I think what we're seeing now, the debate over whether Ukraine will get aid from the United States, even with Russia seeing the Ukraine war as winnable, as long as they can get waited out till the United States stops giving Ukraine aid, it seems like whether this vote goes through or not, and the U.S. continues to supply aid to Ukraine is actually a place we can judge whether if that aid package goes through, their campaign wasn't as successful as they hoped. But if it doesn't go through, if they're able to block something like that, which if you go back to American politics for the last 40, 50, 60 years, Ronald Reagan, all of the presidents, but hey, we want to support democracies around the world against authoritarians, against dictators, against hostile takeovers. Then if they can get America to back away from that kind of mindset that it's had for decades based on or through a campaign like this, then you would have to say largely it's been successful because that would help them then start achieving military goals based on pure influence campaign. I think that'll be a really what we're coming up on is an inflection point on whether or not this thing has really been successful beyond just, throwing it in your enemy's face or whatever, stuff like that. But actually no, we've accomplished real objectives. So, but I want to,
let me just hit you on that point there, because you're absolutely right. And I think it's important for the audience that we stop on this point that really the post-World War II order has relied on the United States behaving like it did in World War II, showing the world that we're not perfect. Like I mentioned, Vietnam. I know we had the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. We've done a lot of bad things in Central America that people can criticize the United States for, and hey, have at it, right? But what I would say is, if you look at the systems, and I've said this in other discussions we had, the 20th century, the post-World War II Cold War was kind of like, okay, how is humanity going to choose how it wants big nations run? Because remember, we've talked about this, like the industrial age being about 200 years old really changed how societies and nations organize. We don't have, monarchs and the Catholic Church isn't running half of Europe like it used to and all that. So the bottom line is that it seems like the world chose to go the direction of the United States and the West. That's why we had, and it's through migratory patterns, people en masse tried to leave countries like Russia and China over the second half of the 20th century. People weren't running from England and America and Canada to Russia. So clearly the world, and when the Berlin Wall came down, that was kind of, like I said, we grew up in this in this era of democracies versus totalitarian regimes. And so that's why I just want to say, you're right, that if the United States is now going to be, because of infighting, backing off from publicly defending a European nation that was invaded for the first time since 1939, that a European country really did what Russia did to Ukraine, then that is going to be a change in the world order. Does that mean the whole world collapses and all that? I don't know. But I would say this.
That would have been brought about by the Russian attempt to undermine the U.S.-led liberal democratic order and to sow cultural and social divisions in the United States. It would be as a result of that, which I think is the key piece in terms of judging the question.
And that's why NATO is such a hot topic for everybody who's on this, because NATO is what's standing in the way of Putin doing what he wants in Europe.
Correct.
And I just feel like I'd rather have a strong NATO than have us leave it and Western Europe. Just let me finish this, because Americans don't realize this. If Western Europe is stuck trying to defend itself from Russia's aggression, they're not going to be buying our goods and services. We're just going to have a global recession and depression. So I don't think Americans appreciate that.
Yeah. And so, but on to the next thing. The question I wanted to get to you, and we were kind of messing with it a few minutes ago, but I want to hit it directly, is that you talked about how Russia, you're going back 100 years, like that they have been either a actual out and out adversary to us, or just someone who like they've been at minimum someone who has been pulling in the opposite direction of us. So it's pretty open even to this day that Russia and then Vladimir Putin they do not wish America well. And Putin has many occasions talked about how he is against quote unquote Western civilization, and wants, like that's something that he's again, he's anti and wants to do something totally different from that. So with all this out there, like this isn't secretive. Why do you think there's a real segment of the American right that is ready to embrace Russia and Putin? I mean, to the extent that like we've seen Tucker Carlson, like go and do a puff piece with Vladimir Putin, go and extol the virtues of Russian grocery stores, and I mean, really trying to really build them up. And it's like he believes there's an audience for this, and that this is that there's somebody that has an itch that he's scratching with this, so. Why do you think that there are so many there's a significant number of people that are ready to embrace someone who openly wishes us ill?
I just want to say a nice joke first that Tucker Carlson showed us. Yeah, no, he just showed us that he must be a true elitist here in the United States, because he seemed to be surprised about things at grocery stores that I've been seeing for the last 20 years, like a cart elevator. But no. So on a serious note, I think there's a mix of many things, right? Like I thought about this, right? Like the easy answer is for me to say, because Russia's done a great job with propaganda over the last 25 years, and the American right about convincing some people, not everybody, that they are the last bastion of white hope in Europe, and all that stuff. I think that's
there's a real thing that like kind of thing.
And so, there is a real thing there. And I'm sure there's a percentage of people that are fawning over Russia today that believe that. But I think that's too simplistic for me to just say, that's the reason. I do think there is a true streak of isolationism in parts of the American kind of body politic that's been there forever. I mean, these are the same people that didn't want us to go into World War II, want us to go into World War I. I mean, that's just part of the American political story, that there's
didn't
always
want to
been
go into
lane.
Vietnam, didn't want
exactly.
Not necessarily just purely from a political ideological spectrum standpoint, but just like no, they want to be they're just more isolationist in general. Yeah.
So I think we got to acknowledge, in a democracy, I'm willing to listen to those people. I think they have a seat at the table in a conversation. I may not agree with them, but I'm not going to say that they're illegitimate. So that's why I think it's difficult to kind of unpack some of it, because I'm sure there are all these competing reasons why people side with Vladimir Putin's view today and not what we traditionally would have considered the American view. Now, it's interesting to me because the propaganda is so good once you look into actually what Russia is about and what Vladimir Putin has said out of his mouth. I found a speech he gave in 2022. So this is months after the Ukraine war had started. This was around the time when a gas line had been sabotaged. And he says, quote, "Sanctions were not enough for the Anglo-Saxons. They moved on to sabotage." And he accused the West of outright Satanism. And he said, "Western hegemony will be smashed. This is inevitable. We must do this for our people." And what made me realize is the naiveness of Americans. And this is what I think I saw when Tucker Carlson interviewed Putin, and Putin owned him like Tucker was his puppy dog, is that we are so simplistic in America with our racial way we look at race, white and black and all this. And a lot of white Americans are convinced that all Europeans look at themselves the same way. And it was interesting to see, and refreshing for me actually, to see Vladimir Putin saying the Anglo-Saxons have moved on to sabotage. When I say refreshing, I mean it as a joke, because what he's reminding us is there's real ethnic differences in the European continent, and Russians are Slavic people, and they don't see themselves as in hegemony with Western Europeans. They see themselves as different than Franks, the French people, than Anglo-Saxons, and from Italians, who they call Romas, and all that. So in Vladimir Putin's mind, he doesn't want to be our friend. He doesn't like
He doesn't
Western.
see, oh, you guys are white, or you guys have a lot of white people.
He doesn't
I
look
have
at
a
it
lot
that
of
way.
white people. Let's be buddies. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, and it's no different how we look at Africa simplistic. I'll just give a win to white Americans too. Black people look and think. A lot of people will think Ethiopia is the same as Nigeria.
Well, your point being that in America, we look at the kind of racial context as being the end all be all, whereas in the rest of the world, there's much more tribalism and much more going on beyond that ethnic, beyond like that beyond just, oh, okay, how let's see your skin tone, and then this is what group you belong in because of that.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's more complex.
Yeah, and I think that's why if you listen to Vladimir Putin in the interview, I mean, what's he talking about? I mean, this is number one. The propaganda is interesting because remember, his goalpost has moved several times now. First, it was he was going into Ukraine to invade Nazis because the government was run by Nazis and they were on his border. He had to do something about it. Then I think about a year ago, I saw him in a speech talking about, well, it was because they were having pedophiles and promoting LGBT stuff and all that. So it was a culture war, which is why, they were too woke. That's why he had to go into Ukraine. And then on Tucker Carlson's show, or, the interview of 2 weeks ago, whatever, it was the 30-minute diatribe about history and the Middle Ages and that, Ukraine never existed because it was part of Russia in the 9th century or the 12th century or whatever. Yeah. So my point is that it's a good example. Like, dude, that's a different culture. Like, we don't, we're projecting all our Americanness on the Russians. They don't see things the way we do.
But that's a good answer. Just that we're projecting our American kind of view of things over there, or at least the people who may be susceptible to kind of fall into this guy who's talking greasy about you. Yeah, we're going to side with him, again, talking directly bad about us. But I think actually this is an example, we touched on it before, just kind of the work that was done before Russia really picked up this and really started to push the divisions in America, kind of when Russia was still reorganizing itself post the fall of the Soviet Union, before they really got back and started pushing forward under this current order that Putin has set up. And that is just, there's been a partisan divide here that has amped up. And, based on this is 2022 numbers, and again, from that Washington Post piece, where you have Americans view, or at least if they ran a poll, YouGov poll, and it's talking about who Republicans have a very unfavorable view of. And they have a much more, or many more Republicans have a very unfavorable view of Joe Biden or Barack Obama or Kamala Harris or Nancy Pelosi than they do Vladimir Putin, like by 30 or 40 or 50%. Like it's a significant gap in terms of, you're looking at negative view of American politicians that are Democrats, and that's like an 80%. Putin is like, 50% or so. So I think that the work that was done previously, it's plausible to say that many people see Putin as the lesser of two evils in this context versus their own countrymen. And so if your own countrymen are the greater of the evils that you faced in the world, then of course, even if Putin is talking crazy about you, you still won't see him as the threat. Again, even though he is a declared adversary of yours, he's saying, yeah, I'm trying to knock down the United States a peg or two. And even with him saying that, it doesn't register because the work that was done and then that continues to be done as far as this partisan divide. And I think that we've talked about that in many times. A lot of that goes into the idea of, if you convince, if you just go back to a bipolar or, like a polar standpoint with just two sides, if you convince people that the other side is so bad, then what you end up with is your people will never hold you accountable. If the other side is so bad, then no matter what I do, I can lie, cheat, steal, but I'm your guy. And if you go to them, then the whole world's going to fall apart. So that effort from a partisan advantage standpoint, let's get a partisan advantage by making people think that all Democrats are pedophiles, or let's get this partisan advantage like that. That actually set the stage for Americans to view, or some Americans to view, someone who outright will say out loud, an adversary nation, a nation that's been an adversary for 100 years, for that, the leader of that nation, a dictator, to say, yeah, I'm trying to knock you guys a peg or two. I'm trying to divide you guys up. And many Americans saying, yeah, that's cool, because you're still the lesser of the two evils that I face today.
Yeah, well, I think, Vladimir Putin is intelligently playing the American system for what it is. We don't want to regulate our media. We don't want to regulate our social media algorithms and force companies to not spread BS. And then we have people like Elon Musk who were praised for buying Twitter so that people can say whatever they want on it without any guardrails, which is okay. But I've been preparing for today. I read how many articles, or so many articles about how much Russian bots and the BS, just their own propaganda, has been permeating Twitter to the point where Elon Musk himself has been retweeting things that have been sourced to Russian intelligence. I'm not saying he's in on it. I'm just saying he's been influenced on it and he's believing it. So I think the train has left the station in terms of Russia even being needed at this point. And this is where
Russia is a rider of this. They're not a driver.
Yeah.
Like, this was happening.
Well, here's the thing.
Russia amped it up.
Let me back that up, because there was a time when Russia did actively, I think, play more of an influence game than it is right now today in 2024. Because, man, in preparing for today, I mean, I'm not even gonna. I can't afford the time to rattle it all off. But it was just being reminded about things like Donald Trump's campaign manager in March became Paul Manafort, who never knew Trump personally. It came out of nowhere, hadn't been in politics for like 30 years or something. And then I'm reading, he was, before Trump, he was a lobbyist for the dictator of Angola, for the dictator of Zaire, for Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator of the Philippines. I mean, this guy was kind of bad news, right? Then we've got, remember, Jeff Sessions had to recuse himself from the investigation on Michael Flynn or something, because Michael Flynn was trying to run diplomacy with the Russian government and looking for back channels before they were even in office. I mean, that would be like finding out if we saw that Nikki Haley was talking to some foreign government right now, just assuming she's going to, it's just weird. So in any case, what I'm getting at is we have now Americans that propagandize each other. And a great example is what just happened last week with the gentleman who was seen as the star witness for the whole Biden impeachment over this Hunter Biden stuff, or the Burisma in Ukraine, the stuff I've had to hear about for 3-4 years now from everybody I know that watches Fox. And this guy got charged for lying. There appears to be nothing in this story. And instead of reporting that last week, like it has been reporting about the lies to its viewers, Fox News stayed silent on it for many days. And I think that's the issue, which is we have a half of this country now that consumes media that makes their own domestic political opponents seem more nefarious, dangerous, and corrupt than our actual foreign adversaries who look to do us harm.
To your point, by selectively reporting what they see,
correct,
by curating what they see in a way that leads to this conclusion,
and never reporting that anything is wrong that they say.
Correct. Yeah. Like that's what I mean. Like they selectively, they curate what people see so that people never do see, like, oh, okay, well, what we were told here was all wrong. Like, oh, okay, no. Like, because people will continue to believe that without any knowledge that this guy, has been indicted for lying about this stuff, and then that was the basis of. And I think that this gets to the end, and this is where I don't think. Well, this goes to your point of the kind of the lack of a regulatory environment, which there was one, like up until the 1980s, there was a regulatory environment in terms of media, news media in particular, fairness doctrine and the like. And what that did was that helped, that regulatory environment helped separate the profit motive from, or the profit-driven decision-making from pure news reporting and gathering. And because I think that's what we're living with right now. The concept of Russia wants to enhance the social and cultural divides in America. Well, who else wants to do that? And who else benefits from that is the American news media. And some are greater offenders than others. But by and large, what we've learned, and what they've learned, and like they're smart people, like is that telling people what they want to hear is better for business from a news media standpoint. Telling people giving people news they don't want to hear is bad for business. And so, and the best example of this, or the most prominent example of this, was in the aftermath of the 2020 election, when Fox was initially reporting, the election was real. It was, he lost, unfortunately lost, but like it was real. And they started losing viewers by the hundreds of thousands. And so they changed their tune and started saying that the election was stolen, because that stopped the bleeding of them losing viewers, because there were other stations that were reporting that, it was stolen. And so Fox was losing its viewers to those other stations. And so in order to not lose ratings, and so therefore to not lose money, they had to start reporting something else, regardless of whether it was true. Just, hey, our people don't want to hear this. And so
let me jump in with you here.
Go ahead.
On this one specifically, and I'm sorry that I just got to do it, because to show the level that this stuff is effective, and this is why I wanted to stop right here. Think about, as you're saying this, then we have last year, Fox actually lost a lawsuit, which is one of the largest ones I've ever heard of for this, the one against
they settled it for a lot of money.
Settled it, for $787 million. Again, that's something they haven't talked about on their network much, right? I understand why. But so their viewers, a lot of them don't even understand that the network that they watch had to settle because there was enough evidence in writing through emails and texts that they allowed these lies to proliferate. Yeah. So that confirms that the big lie is a lie. Yeah. Then what we got is confirmation from their text. The reason why Tucker Carlson doesn't work there anymore is a confirmation of all this, because he was texting, they're calling his boss the C word, and they had to fire him for that, along with other stuff. And he was texting about how he thought the whole big lie was a lie, and he hates Trump. That's why none of this, it's sad that we have this many Americans that have been manipulated. And it's sad because I know a lot of these people, and they're great people. They're not bad people. They're not dumb. But they do believe in something now. And it's difficult.
They're in an information silo. Yeah, they're in an information silo. The one the silo is built around the idea of profitability and maximizing viewership amongst a segment of the population. So there's a real risk there.
And emotionally invested.
That's I want to get to that.
Sad part. Yeah, okay.
I want to get to that. The emotional investment.
Sorry to interrupt.
Well, man, that's actually where I want to go to is, okay, I want to know. I want to have a discussion on whether this can be undone, where Americans can get back on kind of the same page, generally the same page, as far as at least to the countries that wish us ill. Like maybe we all, we might have different views on our friends or the countries we're kind of just do business with or whatever. But actually, the countries that say, yeah, screw you, dude. Like, can we get on the same page with those? Do you think this can be undone? And I think the emotional investment piece is a big part of the concern here, is that there are many people, as we know, once you get emotionally invested in something, then new information, but the way our mind works, bias-wise, like without unconsciously, the way our mind works is once we're emotionally invested in something, we tend to filter information through that emotional investment, which explains also why the idea of not reporting the big lie or not saying the big lie is true, it could lead some to want to change the station or whatever. So are Americans too emotionally invested, or at least some Americans, in the idea that Americans want to be divided, or Americans need to be divided, or that our fellow countrymen are the biggest threat, bigger than even Vladimir Putin, who openly wishes us ill? Like, where do you think? Where do you think this goes from here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this goes away. It for several reasons. One is to the point we're making, right? People are emotionally invested in something, and whenever someone's emotionally invested in something, like we're saying, it's hard to dislodge that, right? Number two is what we already identified too: information silos. We have people in this country, a lot of us, that are in such different information silos that we don't even know what the other person's talking about, right?
And it's profitable to keep people in information silos. So not only you have the psychological barrier, you also have the profit barrier that's saying, hey, let's keep people in these information silos because then we can make more money from the news media perspective.
So there goes two things we've already identified in this conversation that I think make it difficult for us to kind of see things together in any easy way in the near future. But then I think about just not only what we talk about, but like the way that our environment today, where for whatever reason, our culture keeps everyone on edge and angry. Because that's what I found with a lot of
which is another
people,
profit-driven thing from the news.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. I find a lot of the people I know that really consume a lot of that media and that buy into the Russian talking points and kind of this way of being in our politics today are also just constantly consuming things that make them angry, right? And then what happens is some of these folks that I know well, like where I have a good personal relationship to, I don't fight them, but I'll just start slowing down and talking to them. And it's interesting, almost 100% of the time. Yeah. Well, and like walking them off the ledge in a sense, and almost 100% of the time, they end up agreeing with me, and not because I'm right or I'm better viewer or something like that. Is because it's about pragmatism and rationalism. So, for example, like I thought about, this whole thing. Like one of my friends talking about, well, how would you feel if NATO was on your border? And I see why Putin's doing this and this and that. And I just asked him, I was like, you didn't seem too concerned about what Saddam Hussein felt before we invaded him. Like, why do you care what he thinks? Like, what about what we think? Why? Yeah, why are you on it? And that's what I was kind of thinking. Like, and I remember slowing down and he's saying, well, they speak Russian over in Ukraine and this and that. And I said, from that logic and what Putin said at the interview with Tucker, about the ninth century or whatever, I'm like, so, Texas and Colorado, and we have a state called New Mexico. They used to be part of the country of Mexico until we had a war in the 1840s. And guess what? We got that. And now it's part of the United States. And guess what? There's a lot of people in border states that speak Spanish. So just to your logic, Mexico would be justified literally rolling tanks over the Texas border and sending in cruise missiles to Southern California, hitting residential apartment buildings. Why can't they just do that?
Russia did. Yeah.
That's what Russia did, and Russia claims is because those people speak Russian, and that this used to be part of Russia.
And that land was historically, exactly.
Yeah, and so then let's take that logic further, and then the Native Americans should just be able to do what Hamas did to Israel on October 7th, just because they're upset at us that we're here. Like my point is that once you slow people down and start talking like that, they start, oh yeah, man, you know what? I didn't think of it like that. Yeah. And so I think that's part of it too. Is the information silos keep people's minds so angry and so...
Well, no, but you raised... It's not just... It's the silos plus the need to keep them on edge, to keep them a captive viewer. Don't turn it off because, everything... There's a catastrophe waiting around every corner, so keep watching. So, the way that profit drives the way that news media presents things. I mean, we're distinct when I say news media because it should be distinct from entertainment. But what ends up happening is that the lessons from entertainment media are being used by news media to keep people captivated and make more money, so to speak.
It's your favorite terms, heels and baby faces. They stole WWE.
Yeah. And I'll say that to me, I would think that it can't continue like this. So I guess I have a slightly more, at least from a position standpoint, optimistic take than you. But the reasons I say that are probably maybe more pessimistic. And the reason it can't continue like this is because you can't operate a nation in a democratic system like this perpetually. Like this whole, like you can't. Look, this is one of those things where to be a part of any team, you got to want to be a part of a team. And so at a certain point, if a certain number of people don't want to be a part of the team anymore, then you can't hold it together anymore. And so right now, what we're seeing is that there's this pull away, and it's more one-sided, but it's still, regardless, the distance is happening. And I'm not going to say maybe it's one-sided. It is more one-sided, but the result doesn't really matter because you got to have a certain level of buy-in amongst a broad spectrum of the population in order to have the kind of government that we have. Like we always look and say, okay, let's go. When historically America's tried to use military force, take out a government in a foreign nation, and then give them democracy, and it never works. And the reason why you can't just give someone democracy is that the people there have to want it sufficiently to fight, to want to fight to stay together, to want to fight, to work through their problems, to compromise and things like that. That type of stuff isn't easy. What's easy is for one guy to pull out the biggest gun and just say, everybody do what I say. And so our form of government is harder. It requires a level of buy-in. And what we're seeing right now is that for various reasons, there are various forces that are causing or taking advantage of, chicken and egg type of thing, a segment of our population that's pulling away from that doesn't really want to make the whole work anymore. They just want to run the whole show, and that's it. So either you keep pulling and pulling and pulling, either it's going to break, or there's going to be a reaction, and in the form of, like the type of regulations from a news media standpoint that we've had in the past, or something like that. Not necessarily doing the same thing that was done in the past, but accomplishing that type of an objective in a way that accounts for the way the information is presented now. Or we're going to have some kind of reaction that then allows people to get perspective in what's going on in the world, and not just siloed information designed to keep them amped up and keep them as a profit center, keep their attention as a profit center. One of the two have to happen. Like, we can't just perpetually keep going. You're going to bend, and either you're going to break apart or you're going to snap back together. And so, I mean, I don't know which one of those is going to happen, because it depends on a lot of things that need to happen. But I think that's the direction.
You know what's going to happen?
What's that?
That big tech stocks will keep going up, like Meta and Facebook, but Google and then Microsoft, because they make a lot of money when we click, and we have this conflict.
Yeah. Like that. That's that's part. So
buy the NASDAQ 100, but that's not financial advice.
But yeah. But I do want to keep us moving on to the next topic. So we'll jump to the next topic after the break.